England, 1815. Between the gilded ballrooms of the aristocracy and the shadows of servants' quarters, there exists a chasm few dare to cross. I, Eleanor Hartley, never imagined that a night of public humiliation would place me in the path of England's most powerful man, that a simple gesture, the lifting of my chin by aristocratic fingers, would change not only my destiny, but also my understanding of who I truly was, that the words "my lady," spoken by lips that rarely smiled, would become the key to a world that had always been denied me. But what I truly didn't know is that a person's real value never depended on the weight of their purse or the name on their coat of arms. This is the story of a woman who faced society's scorn with her head held high, even when every fiber of her being begged to hide, and who triumphed not because she changed who she was, but because she finally found someone who saw her exactly as she had always been, valuable, worthy, and deserving of love. But before we dive into this story that challenged the rigid hierarchies of Regency England, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in life when you understand, with perfect and painful clarity, exactly where you stand in the world's estimation. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday evening in late spring, in a ballroom that sparkled with more candlelight than I had ever seen in one place, surrounded by people who wore my annual income on their wrists as bracelets. I had been living at Pemberton House for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Not that I was counting, you understand, but when every day feels like a small exercise in surviving one's own inadequacy, the passage of time tends to etch itself rather firmly in one's memory. My position as companion to Viscountess Pemberton had been secured through the tireless efforts of my aunt, who had called in every favor and strained every distant connection to place me in what she called a position of respectability. What she had actually secured was a front-row seat to my own systematic diminishment. The Viscountess herself was not unkind. She was simply absent, in that particular way that wealthy people can be absent even when standing directly in front of you. I existed to her as a useful object, like a particularly reliable footstool or a well-trained lapdog. When she required someone to hold her yarn while she embroidered, I held it. When she needed someone to read aloud the more tedious portions of her correspondence, I read. When she desired company during her afternoon tea but found all her actual friends otherwise engaged, I sat across from her and made appropriately appreciative noises about the weather, the gardens, and the incompetence of her third undercook. It was not the Viscountess, however, who made my life at Pemberton House a particular kind of exquisite torture. That honor belonged to the constellation of young ladies who orbited her household like jeweled planets around a sun. Her niece, Lady Constance Fairfax, her goddaughter, Miss Arabella Worthington, and their various friends who seemed to multiply like particularly vicious rabbits every time I turned around. They had perfected cruelty to an art form, not the obvious vulgar sort of cruelty that announces itself with raised voices and direct insults. Oh no, that would have been beneath them. Their weapons were far more refined. The conversation that fell conspicuously silent when I entered a room, the invitations extended to everyone but mysteriously never reaching me, the observations about quality and breeding delivered just loudly enough for me to hear, but with enough deniability that I could never quite prove they were directed at me. Lady Constance was the undisputed general of these campaigns. Tall, beautiful in that cold, perfect way that certain English roses achieve, and possessed of a wit so sharp you could slice bread with it, she had decided from our first meeting that I was an offense against the natural order. To her credit, she was remarkably consistent in this belief. Not a day passed without some small reminder of my place, delivered with a smile so sweet it could have concealed poison. The ball that evening had been planned for weeks. The Viscountess was hosting it to celebrate something. I confess I had stopped paying close attention to the endless parade of celebrations, each one seemingly identical to the last, except for minor variations in the color of the table linens. What I knew with certainty was that my role in this particular celebration was to remain invisible. I was to assist the ladies with their preparations, help manage any small crises that arose, and then spend the actual event tucked away in some corner where I would not embarrass anyone with my shabby dress and obvious poverty. The dress in question had been my mother's, altered twice and carefully maintained for more years than I cared to count. It was a pale blue that had probably been quite lovely 20 years ago, but now looked merely tired. The lace at the sleeves had been mended so many times that I had long since lost track of which threads were original and which were my own desperate additions. Next to the silks and satins that swirled through Pemberton House that evening, I looked rather like a sparrow who had accidentally flown into a peacock exhibition. I had stationed myself, as instructed, in a small alcove near the refreshment tables. My job was to hover nearby in case the Viscountess needed anything, while simultaneously remaining as unobtrusive as possible. It was a delicate balance, one I had been practicing for 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. I was becoming quite accomplished at it. The evening proceeded as these events always did. Music floated through the air, expensive perfumes mingled with the scent of hothouse flowers, and conversations buzzed with all the important matters of the day: who was courting whom, which families had gained or lost standing, what scandals were whispered about in careful undertones. I watched it all from my corner, simultaneously present and completely removed, like a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. I did not expect to be noticed. I had built an entire strategy around not being noticed, but I had made the critical error of underestimating Lady Constance's commitment to my humiliation. She approached with 3 of her closest friends, all of them glittering like expensive Christmas ornaments. Their laughter carried that particular quality of female mirth that always sounds slightly dangerous, like crystals about to shatter. I felt my shoulders tense automatically, an instinct I had developed over long weeks of learning to recognize the signs of an incoming attack. Lady Constance's voice rang out across the immediate area, pitched perfectly to carry without seeming to shout. She had clearly been practicing this particular performance, and I had the sinking sensation of being an actor who had not been given her lines. She wondered aloud, in tones of apparent genuine curiosity, why certain people felt entitled to occupy space in gatherings designed for their betters. She observed that true quality always showed itself, just as the absence of quality was equally evident to those with discernment. She noted that charity was a virtue, certainly, but there were limits to how far that charity should extend, particularly when it meant diluting the company with individuals who simply could not comprehend the standards expected in respectable society. She never said my name. She did not need to. Every eye in our corner of the ballroom turned toward me. I felt the weight of their gazes like physical objects, heavy and suffocating. My face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. My hands, which had been clasped calmly in front of me, began to tremble. I commanded them to stop. They did not obey. The laughter that followed Lady Constance's observations had a quality of relief to it, as if everyone present was grateful that someone had finally articulated what they had all been thinking. I was the entertainment now, the spectacle, the living embodiment of everything that should know better than to aspire beyond its station. I considered my options with a clarity born of desperation. I could flee, which would give them the satisfaction of having driven me away. I could defend myself, which would be futile, and would likely result in my immediate dismissal from the Viscountess's service. Or I could stand there and endure it, which seemed to be the only option that allowed me to maintain even a shred of dignity. I chose to stand. I kept my eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Lady Constance's head, refusing to meet her gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing tears. My jaw ached from the effort of keeping my expression neutral. My stomach churned with a mixture of shame and rage so intense, I thought I might actually be sick right there on the Viscountess's expensive carpet. And then, through the fog of my humiliation, I became aware of a change in the atmosphere. The laughter died away with unnatural swiftness. The crowd that had been pressing closer, eager to witness my disgrace, suddenly seemed to recede. Even Lady Constance's triumphant expression flickered with something that looked almost like uncertainty. I lowered my gaze and found myself looking at a pair of impeccably polished boots. My eyes traveled upward, expensive black evening clothes, a white cravat tied with mathematical precision, broad shoulders that suggested both strength and aristocratic bearing, and then finally, a face that I recognized immediately, though I had only ever seen it from a distance. Alexander Thornbury, the Marquis of Ashford, stood before me. I knew of him, as everyone in England knew of him. He was wealthy beyond comprehension, powerful beyond measure, and notorious for his coldness. They said he had not smiled in 5 years. They said he had loved once, and when that love was taken from him, had simply stopped participating in the messy business of human emotion. They said many things about the Marquis of Ashford, and none of them suggested he was the sort of man who involved himself in the petty social skirmishes of provincial balls. Yet here he was, looking at me, not through me or past me, as most people in his position did, but directly at me, with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. He extended his hand, gloved, elegant, steady. I stared at it, as if it were a foreign object, unable to comprehend what was being offered. His expression gave away nothing. Those gray eyes, which I had heard described as cold as winter storms, remained fixed on mine with an unwavering focus that was somehow both terrifying and inexplicably reassuring. I do not remember making the decision to place my hand in his. It seemed to happen without my conscious participation, as if my body had assessed the situation and determined this was the only logical response. His fingers closed around mine with a gentleness that contradicted everything I had heard about him. And then he did something that I still, even now, struggle to fully comprehend. He lifted my hand, and with his other hand, he raised my chin so that I was forced to meet his gaze fully. In that moment, with the entire ballroom watching, with Lady Constance's mouth hanging open in undisguised shock, with every rule of propriety and social hierarchy being thoroughly demolished, the Marquis of Ashford spoke 2 words. "My lady." His voice was low, meant only for me, yet somehow it seemed to carry through the entire room. The words themselves were simple, but their implication was revolutionary. He was not acknowledging my existence, he was declaring my worthiness. He was not offering charity, he was extending respect. In those 2 syllables, delivered with absolute certainty and complete disregard for the opinions of everyone watching, he had rewritten the entire narrative of my place in that ballroom. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice had apparently fled along with my capacity for rational thought. I stood there, my hand still in his, my chin still elevated by his touch, and felt something shift fundamentally in my understanding of what was possible. He did not release my hand immediately. Instead, he turned, still holding it, and surveyed the assembled crowd, with an expression that could have frozen fire. His gaze lingered on Lady Constance for a moment, just long enough to communicate something that made her face go pale, before returning to me. When he finally released my hand and stepped back, it was with a slight inclination of his head that suggested not dismissal, but rather a temporary parting. Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who has never doubted his right to occupy any space he chooses. I remained where I was, unable to move, unable to process what had just occurred. Around me, the ballroom slowly returned to life, but the energy had changed completely. People were no longer looking at me with contempt or amusement. Now they looked at me with confusion, speculation, and something that might have been the very beginning of respect. Lady Constance and her friends had disappeared entirely, vanished as thoroughly as if they had never been there at all. The Viscountess materialized at my elbow, suddenly remembering my existence, suddenly concerned about my well-being, suddenly very interested in whether I was enjoying the ball. I answered automatically, saying whatever seemed appropriate, while my mind remained entirely occupied with trying to understand what had just happened and, more importantly, what it meant for whatever came next. The morning after the ball arrived with the kind of cruel brightness that seems specifically designed to punish those who have spent the previous night lying awake, staring at ceiling shadows, and attempting to make sense of the impossible. I had not slept. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment replayed with perfect clarity. The Marquis of Ashford's hand extended toward me, his fingers lifting my chin, those 2 words that had somehow managed to be both a declaration and a revolution. My lady. I had turned the moment over in my mind so many times that it had taken on an almost dreamlike quality, as if perhaps I had imagined the entire thing in some desperate fever dream brought on by acute humiliation. Except I had not imagined it. The evidence presented itself the moment I descended to the breakfast room, where the Viscountess and her assembled guests were taking their morning meal. The conversation, which had been flowing with its usual animated ease, stuttered to an awkward halt the moment I appeared. Eyes that had previously looked through me now fixed upon me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with discomfort. The Viscountess herself, the woman who usually acknowledged my presence with the same vague attention she might give a piece of furniture, actually gestured to the chair beside her. Not the chair at the far end of the table where I usually sat in splendid isolation, but the chair beside her, in a position of proximity that suggested actual importance. I sat, because refusing seemed more dangerous than complying, and tried to ignore the way Lady Constance was staring at me from across the table with an expression that mingled fury, confusion, and what might have been the first stirrings of fear. She looked as if she had spent the night even more sleepless than I had, though for entirely different reasons. The Viscountess inquired about my health, with a concern I found deeply suspicious. She observed that I looked rather pale, and suggested that perhaps I had overtaxed myself with the previous evening's excitement. She wondered, in tones of casual interest that fooled absolutely no one, whether I had enjoyed the ball, and whether any of the guests had been particularly memorable. I responded with careful neutrality, confirming that yes, the ball had been lovely, and yes, I was quite well. Thank you for asking. I did not mention the Marquis. Neither did anyone else, though his presence hung over the table like an invisible guest, commanding attention through sheer absence. It was Miss Arabella Worthington who finally broke the careful silence, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that always preceded something venomous. She mentioned, as if the thought had just occurred to her, that the Marquis of Ashford had been in particularly fine form the previous evening. She wondered if anyone knew what had drawn him to attend what was, after all, a relatively modest provincial gathering. Surely a man of his standing had more important engagements to occupy his time. The Viscountess responded that the Marquis had family connections in the area, a distant cousin or some such relation, and had apparently decided to pay his respects while passing through. It was all very polite, very proper, and very obviously an attempt to explain away something that defied easy explanation. I said nothing. I ate my breakfast with mechanical precision, tasting nothing, and tried to convince myself that the entire incident would fade into obscurity within a day or two. The Tun had notoriously short attention spans. Some new scandal would emerge, some fresh gossip would circulate, and the strange moment when the Marquis of Ashford had called me my lady would be forgotten as quickly as it had occurred. I was, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong. The first indication came that very afternoon. I was in the morning room, attempting to focus on mending one of the Viscountess's shawls, a task that had been assigned to me with the kind of pointed emphasis that suggested I should be grateful for the opportunity to be useful, when a footman appeared with an expression of barely contained excitement. A visitor had arrived. For me. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. Visitors did not call on companions. Visitors called on the Viscountess, or on Lady Constance, or on any of the other young ladies of quality who populated the house. They did not call on impoverished nobodies whose primary qualification was the ability to remain invisible while being simultaneously available. But the footman insisted. A gentleman was waiting in the drawing room, and he had specifically requested my presence. Would I please attend him at my earliest convenience? I descended to the drawing room in a state of confusion so profound it bordered on actual dizziness. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the visitor had confused me with someone else. Perhaps I was still asleep in my small room under the eaves, and this entire morning was an elaborate dream, brought on by eating cheese too close to bedtime. The drawing room door opened. I stepped through. And there, standing by the window with his back to me, examining the Viscountess's collection of porcelain figurines with apparent interest, was the Marquis of Ashford. He turned when he heard me enter. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I understood with perfect and terrifying clarity that the previous evening had not been an aberration or a moment of temporary madness. Whatever had begun in that ballroom was continuing, right here, right now, with an inevitability that felt like watching a boulder roll down a hillside. He greeted me with perfect courtesy, as if there were nothing remotely unusual about his presence in the Viscountess's drawing room, specifically requesting an audience with her impoverished companion. He inquired about my health. He hoped he was not disturbing me. He wondered if perhaps I might enjoy taking a turn around the gardens with him, as the weather was particularly fine, and he found himself desirous of pleasant company. I should have refused. Every instinct of self-preservation I possessed was screaming at me to politely decline, to retreat to my proper place, to avoid whatever trap was being laid. But there was something in his gaze, not pity, not amusement, but a kind of steady certainty that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and was utterly unconcerned about the consequences. that made refusal impossible. I agreed. Of course I agreed. What else could I do? The Viscountess appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, her face arranged in an expression of delighted surprise that would not have convinced a particularly stupid child. She thought it a marvelous idea that I should take some air. She insisted that I borrow her second-best shawl. She practically pushed us toward the gardens with an enthusiasm that made me want to sink into the floorboards and disappear entirely. We walked in silence for several minutes, following the carefully manicured paths between beds of late spring flowers. I was acutely conscious of his presence beside me, the height of him, the way he moved with unconscious grace, the fact that every servant we passed stopped whatever they were doing to stare at us with undisguised fascination. Finally, when I thought I might actually scream from the tension of waiting for him to speak, he asked me a question that I had not been expecting. He inquired about my opinion of a particular novel, a popular romance that had been making the rounds of society. Had I read it? What did I think of the author's treatment of her heroine? I blinked at him, momentarily thrown by the sheer normalcy of the question. Yes, I had read it. The Viscountess's library was one of the few consolations of my position, and I had consumed that particular volume in 2 desperate sittings during a week when Lady Constance's cruelty had been particularly relentless. I told him what I thought, that the heroine was too passive for my taste, too willing to be acted upon rather than acting herself, that the hero's behavior in the 3rd act bordered on the tyrannical, and I was not entirely convinced that the happy ending was actually all that happy, that I had thrown the book across the room at one particularly irritating passage and then immediately felt guilty for treating a borrowed volume so roughly. He laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sound so unexpected that I stopped walking entirely and simply stared at him. They said the Marquis of Ashford never smiled. They were wrong. When he laughed, his entire face transformed, and I caught a glimpse of who he might have been before whatever tragedy had turned him into the cold, distant figure society whispered about. He agreed with my assessment entirely. He, too, had found the heroine frustrating. He wondered why authors seemed to believe that helplessness was an attractive quality in a protagonist. He suggested that perhaps readers were growing tired of heroines who required constant rescue and might prefer characters with more agency and intelligence. We talked about books for the remainder of our walk. Not polite, superficial conversations about the weather or the garden or the tedious minutiae of society gossip, but actual discussions about themes and character development and narrative structure. He asked my opinion, and then actually listened to my answers as if they mattered, as if I mattered. By the time we returned to the house, something had shifted. I was no longer quite as terrified, though I remained deeply confused about his motivations. He took his leave with a promise to call again, if I would permit it. I stood in the drawing room long after he had departed, trying to understand what game he was playing and what role I was meant to perform. The answer came in pieces over the following days. The Marquis of Ashford did not simply call again. He called repeatedly, 3 times in the first week, 4 times in the second. Each visit followed the same pattern. He would arrive, request my company, and we would walk or sit and engage in conversations that ranged across literature, philosophy, current events, and occasionally veered into debates so animated that I forgot entirely to be intimidated by his rank. The effect on my status within the household was immediate and profound. The Viscountess, who had previously treated me as a slightly useful piece of furniture, suddenly discovered that I was a person of taste and intelligence. Lady Constance, who had made my existence a torment, suddenly found urgent business elsewhere whenever I entered a room. The other young ladies, who had previously ignored me except when actively participating in my humiliation, now attempted to strike up friendships with a desperation that would have been funny if it had not been so transparent. I should have been triumphant. I should have reveled in my sudden elevation from nobody to somebody. Instead, I felt increasingly uneasy, because I could not understand why. Why would a man of the Marquess's standing, wealth, and consequence waste his time on someone like me? Why would he court me? And it was courtship. There was no other word for what was happening, when he could have his pick of any woman in England. The question haunted me through every visit, every conversation, every moment when he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I tried to convince myself that perhaps he simply enjoyed my company, that friendship was all he sought, but there was something in the way he watched me, in the careful attention he paid to my words, in the small gestures of consideration that exceeded mere politeness, that suggested his intentions went far beyond friendship, and my own feelings, which I had tried desperately to control, were spiraling into territory that terrified me. I was falling in love with him, helplessly, hopelessly, catastrophically, in love with a man so far above my station that the very notion of union between us was laughable. I tried to guard my heart. I tried to maintain emotional distance. I failed utterly at both. It was during his 8th visit, as we sat in the garden under the pretext of enjoying the afternoon sunshine, that he said something that crystallized all my fears into a single moment of clarity. He mentioned, almost casually, that he found my perspective refreshing, because it was untainted by the artificiality of society, that I had not been trained to dissemble and flatter and manipulate, that my poverty, unfortunate though it was, had given me something more valuable than wealth, authenticity. My poverty. He saw it. Of course he saw it. How could he not? It was there in every mended seam of my dress, every careful word I chose to avoid revealing the depth of my ignorance about topics that people of quality took for granted, every moment of hesitation when faced with some social nicety I had never encountered before. He saw my poverty, and he found it interesting, refreshing. A curiosity to be examined and appreciated, in the same way one might appreciate a particularly charming rustic landscape or an unusual specimen in a natural history collection. The realization settled over me like ice water. I was not a person to him. I was a novelty, an entertainment, a brief distraction from the tedium of his elevated existence. When he tired of this particular amusement, and he would tire, they always did, he would return to his own world, and I would be left behind with nothing but the memory of what it had felt like to be seen. However briefly, as if I mattered, I smiled and nodded and said something appropriate, though I could not have repeated what it was if my life depended on it. And I began, in that moment, the careful process of constructing walls around my heart that I should have built from the very beginning. It was, I told myself, simply a matter of self-preservation. I could not afford to love the Marquis of Ashford. I could not afford to believe that his attention meant anything more than a passing interest in something different. I could not afford to hope. Hope, I had learned long ago, was a luxury reserved for people who could survive its loss. The human heart, I discovered, is a remarkably stubborn organ. You can lecture it about practicality, warn it about inevitable disappointment, and construct elaborate defenses against its more foolish inclinations. It will ignore you completely and proceed exactly as it wishes. Consequences be damned. Despite my best efforts to maintain emotional distance, despite every rational argument I presented to myself during sleepless nights, despite the walls I had attempted to build, I found myself falling deeper into a situation from which there could be no graceful extraction. The Marquis of Ashford had become a fixture in my daily existence, and with each visit, each conversation, each moment of unexpected laughter or shared understanding, the impossible became increasingly difficult to dismiss. It had been nearly a month since that fateful ball, a month during which my life had transformed so completely that I sometimes felt I was living in someone else's story. The Viscountess now consulted me on matters of household management. Lady Constance avoided me with such dedication that we could go days without crossing paths despite living in the same house. Invitations began arriving, not for the Viscountess and her household, but specifically for me. Tea with this family, a musical evening with that one, a garden party where my presence was explicitly requested. I attended these events in a state of perpetual bewilderment, always acutely conscious that my acceptance had nothing to do with any sudden discovery of my worthiness and everything to do with my association with the Marquis. They wanted to study me, these people who had previously looked through me as if I were made of glass. They wanted to understand what had caught his attention, to assess whether I posed a threat to their own matrimonial ambitions, to determine whether this unprecedented courtship would actually lead somewhere or fizzle out as quickly as it had begun. The Marquis himself remained maddeningly enigmatic. He continued his visits with unwavering consistency, appearing at Pemberton House 3 or 4 times each week with the kind of regularity that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Our conversations had deepened considerably from those early discussions of literature. We now ventured into territory that felt dangerously intimate. Our childhoods, our disappointments, our observations about the peculiar theater of society we both inhabited. though from vastly different vantage points. He told me about his estate in Northumberland, describing it with such vivid detail that I could almost see the wild landscape, the ancient stones of the manor house, the particular quality of northern light that he claimed was unlike anywhere else in England. He spoke of his responsibilities, the weight of legacy and expectation, the burden of making decisions that affected hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on his stewardship. He revealed, in careful increments, pieces of himself that I suspected he rarely showed to anyone, and I, fool that I was, reciprocated. I told him about my childhood in the vicarage, the particular challenges of growing up in genteel poverty, where one was expected to maintain appearances without the resources to do so convincingly. I described my father, whose kindness had been matched only by his complete inability to manage finances, and my mother, who had maintained her dignity even as the walls of their world slowly crumbled around them. I spoke of my aunt, who had taken me in after their deaths not out of affection but out of duty, and who had never let me forget the burden my existence placed upon her limited means. These conversations left me feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. There was an intimacy in this sharing of histories, this mutual vulnerability, that suggested something far more significant than a temporary diversion. Yet I could not shake the persistent whisper of doubt that reminded me how impossible this all was. Men like the Marquis of Ashford did not marry women like me. They might enjoy our company, they might find us entertaining or refreshing or whatever other adjective helped them justify the association, but when it came time to make the permanent choices that determined the shape of a life, they returned to their own kind. The first shadow across this strange, suspended happiness came from an unexpected direction. I was in the Viscountess's sitting room, ostensibly helping her sort through correspondence but actually serving my usual function as decorative audience, when she made an observation that seemed casual, but landed with the weight of deliberate warning. She mentioned that she had encountered the Dowager Marchioness of Ashford at Lady Weatherby's card party the previous evening. The Dowager had been as formidable as ever, the Viscountess reported with a small, nervous laugh. She had inquired about the Viscountess's household with particular interest, asking detailed questions about the various young ladies in residence. The Viscountess had, of course, provided all the information requested, though she confessed to finding the interrogation rather intimidating. The message was clear. The Marquis's mother was aware of my existence and was conducting reconnaissance. This should not have surprised me. Of course, his family would take note of his unprecedented attention to an impoverished nobody, but hearing it stated so plainly sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The Viscountess continued, seemingly oblivious to my discomfort. She observed that the Dowager was known to be exceptionally particular about matters of family alliance. She had very specific expectations regarding appropriate connections for her son. She had, in fact, been quietly encouraging a match between the Marquess and Lady Caroline Ashton, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke, for several years now. Lady Caroline was, by all accounts, everything one could want in a future marchioness: impeccable lineage, substantial dowry, accomplished in all the requisite arts, and possessed of the kind of classical beauty that looked well in family portraits. I absorbed this information with the practiced stoicism I had developed over years of hearing about worlds to which I did not belong. Of course, there was a Lady Caroline. Of course, his mother had expectations. Of course, there existed a woman who was actually suitable for a man of his position. The real question was not whether such a person existed, but why I had been foolish enough to let myself forget it, even temporarily. The second blow came 3 days later, during what I had thought would be another of our pleasant afternoon walks. The Marquis arrived as usual, and we set out through the gardens with the easy familiarity that had developed over our many hours together. The weather was particularly fine, and I had allowed myself to relax into the moment, to enjoy his company without the constant internal monologue of warnings and self-recriminations. We had been discussing a recent political development. He valued my opinions on such matters, which I found both flattering and bewildering, when he fell suddenly silent. I glanced at him, and found his expression transformed into something I had not seen before. He looked troubled, almost pained, as if wrestling with some internal conflict that demanded resolution. He began to speak, haltingly at first, about expectations and obligations, about the weight of duty and the complications of position, about how the choices available to men of his standing were often far more constrained than society imagined. He spoke in abstractions, never quite arriving at a specific point. but the subtext was impossible to miss. He was preparing me for disappointment. He was laying groundwork for an eventual retreat. He was, with as much gentleness as he could muster, beginning the process of extracting himself from whatever this was between us, before it progressed to a point where extrication would be impossible. I maintained my composure through sheer force of will. I responded to his abstractions with abstractions of my own, agreeing that yes, duty was indeed important, and yes, one must always consider the broader implications of one's choices, and yes, obligations to family and position were not to be taken lightly. I performed understanding and reasonableness with an expertise born of years of practice at being whatever other people needed me to be. But inside, I was fragmenting. All the fears I had tried to suppress came roaring back with vindictive intensity. Of course this was ending. Of course he was retreating to his proper sphere. Of course I had been a fool to believe, even for a moment, that I could be anything more to him than a temporary aberration from his real life. He seemed to sense my withdrawal, though I flattered myself that I had hidden it well. The conversation limped to an awkward conclusion. He took his leave earlier than usual, and I watched him go with the horrible certainty that something fundamental had shifted, and not in a direction that favored my increasingly fragile emotional state. The visits continued, but they were different now. There was a new tension in our interactions, a careful politeness that replaced the easy warmth we had developed. He was present, but somehow absent, engaged but distracted, as if part of his attention was always elsewhere, wrestling with considerations he could not or would not share. I began to dread his visits, even as I desperately anticipated them. Each one felt like it might be the last. Each conversation seemed to carry the weight of impending farewell. I found myself memorizing details, the exact shade of his eyes in different lights, the way his voice dropped slightly when he said something he considered particularly important, the rare smile that still occasionally broke through his careful reserve. I was collecting memories against the inevitable moment when memories would be all I had left. Lady Constance, who possessed a predator's instinct for weakness, sensed the change in atmospheric pressure. Her avoidance gave way to a renewed campaign of subtle hostility. She began making observations, always within my hearing, about the fickleness of masculine attention, about how easily men tired of novelties once the initial fascination wore off, about the dangers of aspiring beyond one's natural place in the world. Her words found their mark with devastating accuracy, because they echoed precisely the fears that were already consuming me from within. The third blow came not from the Marquis or from Lady Constance, but from an entirely unexpected source. I had been sent to the village on an errand for the Viscountess, some trivial matter involving ribbons that apparently required immediate attention. I was grateful for the excuse to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of Pemberton House, even if only for a few hours. I was examining a selection of completely identical-looking blue ribbons and wondering how anyone could possibly have a strong preference between them when I overheard a conversation from the next aisle. Two women, local gentry by their accents and manner, were engaged in the kind of gossip that passes for entertainment in small communities. They were discussing the Marquis of Ashford, naturally. His unprecedented courtship of the Viscountess's impoverished companion had apparently provided fodder for speculation throughout the county. One of the women expressed puzzlement at his interest. The other responded with the kind of knowing certainty that suggested she had inside information, or at least believed she did. She explained, in tones of sympathetic understanding, that the Marquess had suffered a terrible tragedy some years back. A young woman he had been deeply attached to, practically engaged to, though the formal announcement had not yet been made, had died suddenly. A riding accident, she believed, or perhaps it was a fever. The details were unclear, but the outcome was not. The Marquis had been devastated. He had withdrawn from society entirely for more than a year. When he finally emerged, he was changed, colder, more distant, locked away behind walls that no one seemed able to penetrate. Until now, apparently. The woman observed, with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from not realizing one's words have an audience beyond the intended recipient, that it was rather sad, really. The Marquis had clearly seen something in this Eleanor person that reminded him of his lost love. Why else would a man of his standing pay attention to such an unsuitable prospect? It was obvious he was trying to recapture something that was gone forever, using a convenient substitute who happened to be available. One could only hope the poor girl understood that this would never lead anywhere permanent. It would be too cruel if she had allowed herself to develop actual expectations. I stood frozen in the ribbon aisle, my hands full of blue silk that I could no longer distinguish through the blur of tears I refused to shed. Everything fell into place with horrible clarity. The intensity of his attention, the strange mixture of fascination, and something that looked like pain when he watched me. The moments when he seemed to be seeing someone else entirely when he looked in my direction. I was not Eleanor Hartley to him. I was a ghost, a replacement, a poor substitute for something real and precious that had been taken from him. Every conversation we had shared, every moment of apparent connection, every instance when I had thought he was seeing me, none of it had been real. He was looking through me at someone else, someone who deserved his attention in ways I never could. I purchased the ribbons without any clear memory of making a selection. I returned to Pemberton House in a daze, and I made a decision that felt like the only option available to someone with any shred of self-respect remaining. I could not continue this way. I could not keep offering myself up as a convenient ghost for him to project his lost love upon. I could not keep hoping for something real when I was nothing more than a mirror reflecting someone else's memory. I would have to leave. Not immediately. I had no resources for immediate flight, but I would need to begin making arrangements. I would need to write to my aunt, as distasteful as that prospect was, and beg for assistance in finding another position. I would need to extract myself from this situation before I lost whatever remained of my dignity and my sanity. The Marquis arrived for his next visit to find me polite but distant. I pleaded a headache and kept our interaction brief. He looked concerned, almost hurt by my withdrawal, which would have been funny if it had not been so painful. What right did he have to be hurt when I was the one serving as a replacement for a dead woman? That night, I lay awake yet again, staring at ceiling shadows yet again, but this time with a different quality to my sleeplessness. This time I was not wrestling with hope and fear. I was mourning for something that had never actually existed except in my own foolish imagination. Mourning for the version of myself who had been stupid enough to believe, even briefly, that someone like him could want someone like me for reasons that had anything to do with who I actually was. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would begin the practical steps necessary for departure. Tomorrow I would stop being a ghost and start being myself again, whoever that was. But first, I needed to survive tonight. And that was proving difficult enough. There is a particular species of torture that comes from continuing to inhabit a space where your heart has been broken. Every familiar corridor becomes a gauntlet. Every routine interaction carries the weight of what you know, but cannot speak aloud. Every moment requires a performance of normalcy that exhausts you more thoroughly than any physical labor ever could. I had written to my aunt. The letter had taken 3 attempts to compose, each version requiring me to swallow more pride than I had known I possessed. I explained, with as much dignity as I could muster, that my position at Pemberton House was no longer tenable. I did not provide details. How could I explain that I had been foolish enough to fall in love with a marquis who saw me as nothing more than a convenient replacement for a dead woman? Instead, I cited a general incompatibility of temperament and expressed hope that she might assist me in securing alternative employment. Her response arrived within a week, and its contents were about as helpful as I had anticipated. She expressed disappointment in my inability to maintain a perfectly adequate position. She reminded me, at length, of the considerable effort she had expended in securing this placement. She observed that young women in my circumstances could not afford to be particular about their situations. However, she concluded with grudging acknowledgement that she would make inquiries among her acquaintances about possible openings, though I should not expect anything approaching the quality of what I was so foolishly abandoning. It was not encouraging, but it was something, a potential escape route, however uncertain. I needed only to maintain my composure and continue my duties until an alternative presented itself. How difficult could that be? Extraordinarily difficult, as it turned out. The Marquis had not accepted my attempts at distance with the graceful retreat I had anticipated. Instead, he had intensified his efforts in ways that suggested either complete obliviousness to my emotional state or a deliberate campaign to make my resolution as difficult as possible. His visits increased in frequency. His attention became more focused. And most troublingly, he began to press me with questions about my welfare that suggested he had noticed my withdrawal and was determined to understand its cause. I deflected these inquiries with practiced skill, citing fatigue or minor ailments, or the general pressures of my position. He listened with an expression that suggested he did not believe a word I said, but was willing, for the moment, to accept my explanations. The concern in his eyes was particularly difficult to bear. It would have been so much easier if he had been cold or dismissive. Instead, he looked at me as if my unhappiness genuinely troubled him, as if he actually cared about my emotional state beyond its utility as a mirror for his own lost love. Lady Constance, meanwhile, had sensed blood in the water. My relationship with the Marquis, if it could even be called that anymore, was clearly in decline, and she was determined to hasten its demise. Her campaign of whispers and insinuations reached new heights of creativity. She began spreading carefully crafted rumors about my background, suggesting improprieties in my history that were completely fabricated, but just plausible enough to gain traction among those inclined to believe the worst. I heard myself described as an adventuress, as someone who had deliberately positioned herself to trap a wealthy nobleman, as a scheming fortune hunter who had exploited the Marquis's well-known vulnerability regarding his lost love. The irony of that last accusation was almost funny. I was being vilified for the very thing that was destroying me, for serving as a replacement I had never volunteered to become. The whispers reached the Marquis, of course. They could hardly fail to, given Lady Constance's dedication to ensuring their widespread circulation. I knew they had reached him because of the way his expression darkened when he arrived for his next visit, and the carefully controlled anger in his voice when he asked me, with studied casualness, whether anyone had been treating me with less than appropriate respect. I assured him that everything was fine, that I paid no attention to idle gossip, that the opinions of small-minded people held no power over me. I lied with such conviction that I almost believed myself. He did not believe me at all. He looked at me with an intensity that made me want to confess everything: the overheard conversation in the ribbon shop, my knowledge of his lost love, my understanding that I was nothing more than a convenient ghost, my plans to leave as soon as alternative arrangements could be made. But I held my tongue, because what good would confession do? It would only make an already impossible situation more complicated and painful for everyone involved. The situation deteriorated further when the Dowager Marchioness herself made an appearance. She arrived at Pemberton House with the kind of formal advance notice that suggested this was not a social call, but a military operation. The Viscountess went into paroxysms of anxious preparation, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every servant understood the critical importance of perfect performance. I attempted to make myself invisible, hoping to avoid an encounter that could only end badly. The Dowager, however, had other plans. She specifically requested that I be present during her visit, a summons that carried all the warmth of an invitation to one's own execution. The Dowager was everything I had been led to expect: tall, imposing, elegantly dressed in a manner that suggested both wealth and absolute confidence in her own superiority. Her eyes, which bore an unfortunate resemblance to her son's, swept over me with the kind of comprehensive assessment one might give to livestock at market. I could practically see her cataloging my every deficiency: the mended dress, the hands that bore evidence of work rather than leisure, the complete absence of jewelry or any other outward sign of means. She engaged me in conversation with the precision of a surgeon performing a delicate and potentially fatal operation. She inquired about my family background, my education, my accomplishments, my prospects. Each question was designed to expose the fundamental inadequacy of my position, and each of my answers, truthful but unavoidably revealing, provided exactly the ammunition she sought. She was not overtly cruel. She did not need to be. Her manner communicated everything necessary without requiring vulgar directness. I was unsuitable. I was inappropriate. I was a mistake that needed to be corrected before it became permanent. She never stated these conclusions explicitly, but they hung in the air between us with such weight that pretending not to understand them would have required a level of willful ignorance I could not muster. The Viscountess hovered throughout this interview like an anxious sparrow, attempting to interpolate positive observations about my character and usefulness. Her efforts only served to underscore how desperately inadequate my qualifications were for the role everyone now assumed I was auditioning for, that of the future Marchioness of Ashford. When the Dowager finally departed, she left behind an atmosphere of such profound discomfort that even the servants seemed relieved to escape to their duties. The Viscountess patted my hand with nervous sympathy and suggested that perhaps I should rest. I agreed, grateful for an excuse to retreat to my small room, where I could process what had just occurred without an audience. The message had been delivered with perfect clarity. The dowager would not accept me, would never accept me. Any fantasies I might have harbored about somehow becoming acceptable through the force of the Marquis's regard had been thoroughly demolished. I was not just poor or unsuitable in the abstract. I was specifically and comprehensively unacceptable to the woman whose opinion would matter most, if this impossible courtship were ever to become something real. That evening, the Marquis arrived unannounced, which was unusual enough to send the household into mild chaos. He asked to speak with me privately, a request that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances, but which the Viscountess granted with alacrity, apparently hoping that whatever was about to occur would resolve the increasingly uncomfortable situation one way or another. We went to the library, a room that had become our unofficial territory during his visits. He closed the door behind us, also scandalous, but I was beyond caring about propriety at this point, and turned to face me with an expression I could not quite decipher. He informed me that he had heard about his mother's visit, that he was aware she had conducted what amounted to an interrogation, that he was deeply sorry if she had caused me any distress. He wanted me to know that her opinions, while he respected her in general, did not dictate his choices, that he was a grown man, perfectly capable of making his own decisions about his associations and his future. It was meant to be reassuring. It was meant to demonstrate his independence and his commitment to whatever this was between us. Instead, it filled me with a despair so profound I could barely breathe through it, because he still was not seeing me. Even now, even in this moment of apparent declaration, he was responding to what he thought I needed, rather than addressing the fundamental truth that stood between us like an unbridgeable chasm. He thought I was worried about his mother's approval. He thought my distress stemmed from concerns about social acceptance. He had no idea that the real problem was so much more fundamental and so much more impossible to solve. I could not be her. I could not be the woman he had lost. I could only ever be myself, Eleanor Hartley, poor and plain and utterly unremarkable, except for the accident of having reminded him of someone worth remembering. And that would never be enough, no matter how much he convinced himself otherwise in moments of what he probably believed was noble defiance of social convention. I thanked him for his consideration. I assured him that I understood his position. I suggested, with as much gentleness as I could manufacture, that perhaps we should both take some time to reflect on the situation and its inevitable complications. I said all of this calmly, rationally, as if my heart were not actively breaking into smaller and smaller pieces with each word. He looked at me with confusion that slowly transformed into something that might have been hurt. He asked if I was trying to end our friendship. He used that word, friendship, which would have been laughable if it had not been so painful. I told him I was simply being realistic about the vast distance between our positions and the practical impossibility of bridging that distance in any meaningful way. He left shortly after, and the expression on his face as he departed haunted me long into the night. He looked lost, confused, as if I had suddenly started speaking a language he did not understand, which, in a sense, I suppose I had. The language of reality. The language of someone who could no longer afford to live in the fantasy we had been constructing together, one pleasant conversation at a time. The next few days passed in a blur of misery barely concealed beneath a veneer of functional competence. I performed my duties. I responded when spoken to. I maintained the appearance of normalcy with such dedication that I barely recognized myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed hollowed out, as if everything vital had been scooped away, leaving only an empty shell moving through familiar motions. Lady Constance chose this moment of maximum vulnerability to strike her final blow. She cornered me in the morning room, where I had been attempting to focus on mending a tablecloth, busy work assigned to keep me occupied and out of the way. She sat down across from me with an expression of false sympathy that immediately set my nerves jangling. She began by observing that I must be feeling quite confused about the recent developments with the Marquis. She understood that I had likely developed certain expectations, given his unprecedented attention. She wanted me to know that she bore me no ill will, despite our previous difficulties. In fact, she felt it was her duty as someone more experienced in the ways of society to offer me some friendly guidance. What followed was a masterclass in cruelty disguised as concern. She explained with excruciating detail about the Marquis's lost love, about how everyone who knew him understood that he had never recovered from that tragedy. about how various women over the years had attempted to capture his attention, hoping to be the one who finally broke through his grief, and how all of them had failed because he simply was not capable of loving anyone the way he had loved her. She observed, with what she probably thought was kindness, that I bore a certain superficial resemblance to the deceased woman. Not in the details, of course. The late Miss whatever her name was had been a true beauty from an excellent family, whereas I was, well, myself. But there was something about the coloring, or perhaps the general shape of the face, that had apparently caught his attention and triggered his interest. She wanted me to understand that this was all I would ever be to him, a pale echo of something lost, a reminder of what he could never have again. His attention to me was not about who I actually was, but about who I accidentally resembled. And while she supposed it must have been flattering to receive such notice from such a distinguished gentleman, I should not mistake that attention for anything real or lasting. She delivered all of this with a smile, with gentle tones, with the manner of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary service. And then she left me sitting there with my mending forgotten in my lap, and my last remaining illusions shattered beyond any possibility of repair, because even though I had already known all of this, had already understood that I was nothing more than a convenient ghost, hearing it stated so explicitly, having it laid out with such clinical precision, destroyed something in me that I had not realized was still intact. I was done. Completely, thoroughly done. I could not remain in this house for one more day than absolutely necessary. I could not continue to encounter the Marquis and maintain this pretense of cordial distance, while knowing that every moment he spent with me was actually a moment he spent with a memory. I could not survive another encounter with the Dowager's contempt, or Lady Constance's malicious pity, or the Viscountess's nervous attempts to smooth over an increasingly untenable situation. That evening, I composed another letter to my aunt. This one was far less concerned with pride or dignity. I informed her that I needed to leave Pemberton House immediately, and that I would accept any position she could secure, regardless of its nature or location. I would work as a governess in the remotest corner of Scotland. I would serve as a companion to the most disagreeable old woman in England. I would do whatever was necessary, just as long as it took me far away from this place and these people, and the unbearable weight of being a ghost in someone else's unfinished love story. I posted the letter the next morning, and I began the grim process of waiting for deliverance that might never come. The human capacity for self-deception is truly remarkable. Even when you know the truth with absolute certainty, even when every piece of evidence points to a single inescapable conclusion, some stubborn part of the soul continues to whisper that perhaps you are wrong, that perhaps there is an explanation you have not considered, that perhaps hope is not quite as dead as you have declared it to be. I tried very hard to silence that voice in the days following my second desperate letter to my aunt. I had made my decision. I had accepted the reality of my situation. I was simply waiting for the mechanism of escape to present itself so I could execute my departure with whatever dignity remained available to me. The Marquis, however, was not cooperating with my plan for a clean break. He arrived 3 days after my encounter with Lady Constance, and his demeanor suggested that something had shifted in him as well. There was a new determination in the set of his shoulders, a purposefulness to his movements that I had not observed before. When he requested my company for a walk, our usual ritual, though now weighted with such different meaning, I considered refusing. But refusal would require explanation, and explanation would require revealing truths I was not prepared to articulate. We walked in silence for several minutes, following the garden paths that had become so familiar over the past months. The spring flowers had given way to early summer blooms, and the air carried the heavy sweetness of roses in their first full flowering. It should have been pleasant. Instead, it felt like attending a funeral for something that had never quite lived. He stopped abruptly near the fountain at the garden center, turning to face me with an intensity that made my carefully constructed defenses tremble. He began to speak, and what emerged was not at all what I had been expecting. He told me that he knew I had been withdrawing, that he had felt the distance growing between us, and had initially attributed it to external pressures, his mother's interference, Lady Constance's malicious gossip, the general disapproval of society. But he had come to understand that the real problem was something else entirely, something I was not willing to articulate but which he believed he had finally identified. I felt my breath catch. Had he somehow discovered that I knew about his lost love? Had someone told him about the conversation I had overheard in the ribbon shop, or about Lady Constance's cruel revelations? What he said next, however, made it clear that he had reached an entirely different conclusion, one that was somehow both completely wrong and devastatingly close to a truth I had not fully acknowledged even to myself. He believed I doubted his sincerity, that I thought his attention was merely a passing fancy, a bored aristocrat's temporary amusement with someone different from his usual circle. He wanted me to understand that nothing could be further from the truth. His interest in me was not casual. It was not superficial. It was, in fact, the most real thing he had experienced in years. He spoke about his life before our meeting, the emptiness of social obligations performed without genuine engagement, the endless parade of suitable young women who bored him to distraction, the sense that he was simply moving through the motions of an existence, rather than actually living. And then he had encountered me, and something had shifted. Conversations became interesting again. The world became less gray. He had remembered what it felt like to actually want to spend time with another person, rather than simply enduring their company out of politeness or duty. Every word he spoke was sincere. I could hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes. He believed what he was saying. He thought he was reassuring me, demonstrating the depth of his regard, proving that I was not simply a diversion, but something far more significant. And it was precisely this sincerity that made everything so much worse. Because he was right that his feelings were real, but he was wrong about what those feelings actually were. He did not love Eleanor Hartley. He loved the way Eleanor Hartley allowed him to feel again after years of emotional numbness. He loved the reminder of a time when he had been capable of genuine connection. He loved the ghost I resembled, and he had convinced himself that this constituted actual love for the person I was. I opened my mouth to respond, though I had no idea what I was going to say. Before I could form words, however, he continued with something that stopped my breath entirely. He told me about her, about Caroline, about the woman he had loved and lost 5 years ago. He described meeting her during his first season after coming into his title, both of them young and somewhat overwhelmed by the social machinery that suddenly surrounded them. She had been everything the dowager wanted in a future marchioness: appropriate family, proper accomplishments, the kind of beauty that looked well in portrait paintings. But more than that, she had been kind, genuinely kind, in ways that had nothing to do with social performance or strategic positioning. She had laughed easily, thought independently, and treated people with respect regardless of their station. They had not been officially engaged, but everyone understood that an announcement was imminent. He had been planning the proposal, working up the courage to make a formal declaration of what everyone already knew. And then she had fallen ill. A fever that seemed minor at first, but escalated with terrifying speed. Within a week, she was gone. He described the aftermath with a detachment that was somehow more affecting than raw emotion would have been. The way he had retreated from everything and everyone. The months that passed in a blur of grief and guilt. Guilt over things left unsaid, over the proposal delayed too long, over the future that had been snatched away before he could properly claim it. The slow, painful process of learning to function again, while feeling like a significant part of himself, had been buried along with her. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror, because I understood exactly where this confession was leading. He was going to tell me that I reminded him of Caroline. He was going to admit that my resemblance to her was what had initially caught his attention. And then he was going to attempt to explain that his feelings had evolved beyond that initial recognition, that I had somehow become important to him in my own right, rather than as a substitute for someone lost. He would mean it. He would believe it completely, and it would not matter at all, because the foundation of everything between us was built on the accident of my resemblance to a dead woman. But what he actually said was not what I expected at all. He told me that yes, there had been a moment, just a moment, during that first encounter at the ball, when something about me had triggered a memory of Caroline. Not a resemblance precisely, but something in the way I had held myself under Lady Constance's attack, the dignity maintained despite obvious distress, that had reminded him of Caroline's particular brand of courage. It had caught his attention, made him notice me when he might otherwise have remained on the periphery of that scene. But that momentary echo was not why he had continued to seek my company. It was not why he found himself thinking about our conversations long after they ended. It was not why he had come to value my opinions, enjoy my wit, admire my intelligence and resilience. Those things had nothing to do with Caroline and everything to do with who I actually was. He acknowledged that he understood how it must look to me. A wealthy man paying unprecedented attention to someone of limited means. Someone vulnerable to being hurt by false promises or temporary interest. He understood my caution. He even respected it, though it frustrated him. But he needed me to know that his intentions were entirely honorable and entirely serious. He wanted to court me properly. With my permission, he intended to speak with the Viscountess about formalizing his addresses. He had already informed his mother that he would be making his own decisions regarding his future, and that her approval, while desired, was not required. He was prepared to face whatever social consequences emerged from choosing someone the Ton considered unsuitable. Because I was not unsuitable. I was remarkable. And if I would permit him to prove it, he would spend whatever time necessary demonstrating that his regard was neither temporary nor based on anyone other than the woman standing before him. He finished this extraordinary speech and stood there, waiting for my response, his expression vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. The Marquis of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England, was asking for my permission to court me. The impossibility of the situation would have been funny if it had not been so thoroughly heartbreaking, because I wanted to believe him. Every fiber of my being wanted to accept his words at face value, to trust that he saw me clearly and loved what he saw. But Lady Constance's voice echoed in my memory, providing unwanted commentary on everything he had just said. Of course, he believed his feelings were genuine. Of course, he had convinced himself that his interest transcended that initial moment of recognition. People were remarkably skilled at constructing narratives that allowed them to feel good about their choices, even when those choices were built on foundations of self-deception. I found my voice, though it sounded strange to my own ears. Too calm, too measured, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I thanked him for his honesty. I acknowledged the honor he was extending through his interest and his willingness to defy convention. I recognized the sincerity of his statements and the courage required to make them. And then I told him that I could not accept his courtship. The words felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside me, leaving ragged wounds in their wake. But they were necessary, because I could not build a future on the foundation of being someone's second-best ghost. I could not spend a lifetime wondering whether he saw me or saw her when he looked in my direction. I could not live with the knowledge that I had been chosen because I happened to trigger a memory at a convenient moment. He stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking in tongues. This was clearly not the response he had anticipated. He began to argue, to press for explanation, to demand understanding of what objection I could possibly have to what he was offering. I did not provide the explanation he sought. Instead, I told him that my position in the Viscountess's household was temporary, that I would be leaving soon to take up a new situation elsewhere, that I was grateful for his friendship and the kindness he had shown me, but that continuing any form of association would not be appropriate given the differences in our stations and the inevitable misunderstandings that would result. I delivered all of this in the same measured, distant tone, as if I were discussing the weather rather than dismantling the most significant relationship I had ever experienced. And then, before he could formulate another argument, before I could lose my resolve entirely, I excused myself and fled back to the house. I did not run. I walked with careful dignity, my spine straight and my head high. But inside, I was in full retreat, desperate to reach the safety of my small room before the composure I had maintained through sheer force of will finally crumbled. I made it to my door, closed it behind me, and only then allowed myself to collapse. The tears I had been suppressing for weeks finally broke through, and I wept with the kind of abandoned despair that leaves you hollow and exhausted. I cried for what I could not have, for what had never actually existed except in wishful imagination, for the future I had briefly allowed myself to envision, before reality reasserted itself with cruel finality. The next morning brought a response from my aunt. A position had been secured, a governess role in a household in Yorkshire, far north of London, and respectably distant from anything resembling fashionable society. The family was looking for someone to educate their 3 daughters, aged 6, 8, and 10. The salary was modest but adequate. I could take up the position as soon as arrangements could be made for my travel. It was exactly what I had requested. An escape. A fresh start far from the scene of my foolishness. A chance to rebuild some semblance of dignity and purpose in a place where no one knew about my brief, painful brush with a world I had never belonged to. I accepted immediately. I informed the Viscountess of my impending departure, citing family obligations and the opportunity for a more permanent situation. She expressed surprise and made perfunctory noises about being sorry to lose me, though I suspected she was mostly relieved to be freed from the increasingly awkward situation my presence had created. I began the process of packing my few belongings. It did not take long. I had arrived with little and had acquired even less during my months at Pemberton House. Within 2 days, I would be gone. Within a week, I would be in Yorkshire, beginning a new chapter that had nothing to do with marquises or lost loves, or the painful lesson that some things remained impossible no matter how desperately you wished otherwise. The Marquis came one more time before my departure. I refused to see him. I sent word through a servant that I was indisposed and unable to receive visitors. It was cowardly, perhaps, but I could not face another conversation, another attempt at persuasion, another moment of seeing hope in his eyes, when I knew that hope was built on mistaken foundations. He left a letter. I found it slipped under my door that evening, written in a bold hand on expensive paper that seemed to mock the shabby surroundings of my small room. I stared at it for a long time, before finally opening it, knowing that whatever it contained would only make everything harder. The letter was not long. He wrote that he understood I had decided to leave, and that he would not pursue me if that was truly what I wanted, but he asked me to consider whether I was making this choice because of genuine lack of interest in him, or because I had convinced myself that something between us was impossible when it was actually only difficult. He asked me to think about whether I was protecting myself from potential hurt by ensuring that I experienced actual hurt instead. He closed by saying that he would wait, that if I changed my mind, his offer would remain open, that he would be there if and when I was ready to trust what he felt for me, what he believed we felt for each other. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, placed it in the bottom of my small trunk beneath my few dresses, and tried very hard not to think about what I was leaving behind. Tomorrow, I would board a coach for Yorkshire. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of forgetting. Tomorrow, I would start building a life that did not include impossible dreams or aristocratic courtships, or the memory of what it had felt like, however briefly, to be seen as if I mattered. Tomorrow. But tonight, I allowed myself one final moment of grief for what might have been if the world had been different, if I had been different, if the foundations of our connection had not been built on the shifting sand of resemblance and memory, and the desperate human need to recapture what was irretrievably lost. Tonight, I let myself mourn. Tomorrow, I would move forward. There really was no other choice. The journey to Yorkshire took 3 days of uncomfortable travel, during which I had far too much time to think, and far too little ability to distract myself from the circular pattern my thoughts insisted on following. I watched the landscape change through the coach window, the gentle rolling hills of the south giving way to the wilder, more dramatic terrain of the north, and tried to convince myself that I was moving toward something rather than simply fleeing from it. The family I would be serving was named Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood had made his fortune in manufacturing, something to do with textiles, though the details remained vague in my understanding. His wife was the daughter of a minor baronet who had married slightly beneath her station, but had gained financial security in the exchange. They had 3 daughters who required education in the accomplishments expected of young ladies, hoping to make respectable matches when the time came. It was respectable employment. It was honest work. It was exactly the kind of position someone in my circumstances should be grateful to secure. I repeated these truths to myself with the regularity of prayer, hoping that eventually they would penetrate the fog of misery that had settled over me since leaving Pemberton House. The Blackwood residence, when I finally arrived, proved to be a substantial property that spoke to new money trying very hard to appear as old money. Everything was slightly too perfect, too carefully arranged, as if someone had studied what wealth should look like, and then executed that vision with more enthusiasm than subtlety. Still, it was handsome enough, and certainly far more comfortable than anything I had experienced since my parents' deaths. Mrs. Blackwood received me in her drawing room with the kind of careful assessment I had become unfortunately familiar with over recent months. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, and possessed a nervous energy that suggested anxiety about maintaining the social position her marriage had secured. She explained my duties at length, emphasizing the importance of producing accomplished young ladies who would reflect well on the family's standing. The girls themselves were introduced shortly after: Margaret, Anne, and little Catherine, ranging from 10 years down to 6. They regarded me with the frank curiosity of children who had not yet learned to disguise their thoughts. Margaret, the eldest, asked immediately whether I knew how to play the pianoforte, as their last governess had been deficient in that skill. Anne wanted to know if I would be teaching them French because she had been promised French lessons. Catherine simply stared at me with enormous eyes and clutched a rather battered doll to her chest. I assured them that yes, I could teach pianoforte and French, along with everything else expected in their education. They seemed cautiously satisfied with this response, and I was shown to my room, a small but private space in the upper floors of the house, significantly better than the cramped quarters I'd occupied at Pemberton House. The work itself was demanding, but not unpleasant. The girls were bright and generally well-behaved, though Margaret showed signs of the stubbornness that would serve her well in life if properly channeled. I fell into the routine of lessons and supervision, with the relief of someone who desperately needed structure to prevent thinking about anything beyond immediate responsibilities. Days became weeks. Spring shifted into full summer. I wrote to my aunt to confirm my safe arrival and express gratitude for her assistance in securing the position. I did not mention the Marquis or any of the circumstances that had precipitated my departure from Pemberton House. What would have been the point? That chapter of my life was closed, and dwelling on it served no purpose beyond prolonging pain that needed to fade. Except, the pain was not fading. If anything, it was intensifying in strange ways. I found myself thinking about him at the most inappropriate moments, during lessons when I should have been focused on declining Latin verbs, during meals when I should have been monitoring the girls' table manners, during the evening hours when I sat alone in my room and tried to read books that could not hold my attention. I dreamed about him. Not romantic fantasies, but mundane recollections. The way he had looked when arguing a point he felt passionate about, the particular quality of his rare laugh, the expression on his face when he had made that final, impossible offer that I had refused. I would wake from these dreams feeling worse than if I had not slept at all, haunted by the memory of something I had deliberately walked away from. The letter remained in my trunk, unread since that first painful examination. I knew it was there. I knew exactly where I had placed it, and I knew that reading it again would be an act of self-destructive foolishness that would only make everything harder. This knowledge did not stop me from thinking about it constantly, from imagining what it would feel like to take it out and read his words again, to reconnect, however briefly, with the possibility I had rejected. 6 weeks after my arrival in Yorkshire, something happened that forced me to confront truths I had been desperately avoiding. Catherine, the youngest Blackwood daughter, had been struggling with her letters. She was a sweet child, but easily distracted, and the tedium of learning to read was clearly testing her patience. I had been working with her individually, trying different approaches to maintain her interest, when she looked up at me with those enormous eyes and asked a question that landed with unexpected force. She wanted to know if I had ever been in love. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. It was an odd question from a 6-year-old, though perhaps not entirely surprising given the romantic novels I knew circulated among the household staff. I attempted to deflect with humor, suggesting that love was a topic for when she was older and had finished learning her alphabet, but Catherine was persistent. She informed me that her mother had told her that love was the most important thing in the world, even more important than money or titles or fine houses. She wondered if I agreed with this assessment, and if I did, why I looked so sad all the time when I thought no one was watching. The observation, delivered with the casual brutality of childhood honesty, struck something deep inside me. I had thought I was maintaining appearances adequately. I had believed my performance of normalcy was convincing. Apparently, I had been wrong, at least to those paying close enough attention. I told Catherine, with as much composure as I could gather, that yes, love was indeed very important, and that sometimes love meant making difficult choices, including the choice to let go of something that was not quite right, even if it had seemed wonderful at the time. She accepted this answer with the philosophical equanimity of the very young, and returned her attention to her letters. But the conversation lodged itself in my mind and refused to be dislodged, because the truth was that I had no idea whether my choice had been the right one or simply the most cowardly one. I had convinced myself that leaving was necessary because I could not bear to be a replacement for someone dead. But what if the Marquis had been telling the truth? What if his feelings for me were genuine and separate from his grief over Caroline? What if I had taken Lady Constance's poisonous observations and used them to justify running away from something that terrified me, not because it was false, but because it was real? The more I examined my reasoning, the more it seemed to crumble. Yes, he had known Caroline. Yes, there had been an initial moment of recognition that had caught his attention, but nothing about his behavior during our months of acquaintance had suggested he was seeing someone else when he looked at me. He had been interested in my thoughts, my opinions, my reactions, all things that were specific to who I was, not who I might remind him of, and I had thrown all of that away. Not because he had given me reason to doubt him, but because I had been so convinced of my own unworthiness that I could not accept that someone like him might genuinely value someone like me. The realization was devastating. I had been so focused on protecting myself from being hurt by serving as a replacement that I had never stopped to consider whether I might be wrong about the entire foundation of my fears. I had let Lady Constance's cruelty and my own insecurities convince me that the impossible was actually impossible, when perhaps it had only been difficult. I spent a sleepless night wrestling with this new understanding, trying to determine what, if anything, could be done about it now. I had left. I had refused him. I had made my position clear in the most definitive way possible. Even if I wanted to reverse that decision, and I was beginning to suspect I wanted exactly that, how could I possibly justify returning after making such a dramatic exit? Pride suggested I should maintain my course. I had made my choice, and changing my mind now would look like exactly what it was. A frightened woman who had panicked and fled and then regretted that flight. It would be humiliating to return. It would require admitting I had been wrong about everything. But staying would mean living with the knowledge that I had destroyed something real, because I had been too afraid to believe in it. It would mean spending the rest of my life, wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to trust what he said he felt, to trust what I knew I felt, to risk the possibility of hurt in exchange for the possibility of genuine happiness. The choice should have been obvious. Pride versus potential joy. Safety versus risk. The known misery of regret versus the unknown territory of hope. I sat in my small room as dawn broke over the Yorkshire countryside, and I made a decision that terrified me more than anything I had ever done. I would go back. I would return to... where? Pemberton House was no longer an option. I had left that position definitively. I could not simply appear on the Viscountess's doorstep and request reinstatement. But the Marquis had said he would wait. He had said his offer remained open. I had to hope that he had meant it, and that enough time had not passed to make him reconsider. I composed a letter to him that went through 7 drafts before I finally produced something I could bear to send. I apologized for my hasty departure and my refusal of his courtship. I explained as honestly as I could manage without descending into complete mortification that I had been frightened by the intensity of my own feelings and had convinced myself that his regard could not possibly be real. I acknowledged that I might be too late, that he might have moved on, or decided I was too much trouble to be worth pursuing. But if his offer still stood, if he still wished to court me properly, I would very much like to accept. I sealed the letter before I could change my mind for the 8th time, and made arrangements to post it that same day. Then I waited for a response with the kind of anxious dread normally reserved for impending disasters. The response came faster than I had anticipated. Within a week, I received not a letter, but the man himself. The Marquis of Ashford arrived at the Blackwood residence unannounced, causing considerable consternation among the household staff, and sending Mrs. Blackwood into paroxysms of excitement at having such a distinguished visitor. He requested to speak with me, and Mrs. Blackwood, who clearly had no idea what to make of this development but was not about to refuse a marquis, granted permission with alacrity. We met in the Blackwoods' drawing room, which suddenly seemed absurdly small with his presence filling it. I had forgotten the sheer physical impact of him, the height, the breadth of shoulders, the intensity of those gray eyes that were currently fixed on me with an expression I could not quite decipher. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe, and he appeared to be conducting some kind of internal debate about where to begin. Finally, he told me that he had received my letter, that he had read it multiple times, trying to ensure he understood correctly what I was saying, that he had then immediately arranged to travel north, because this was not a conversation that could be conducted through correspondence. He wanted to know if I had meant what I wrote, if I truly understood what I was accepting, because he would not go through this again, would not court me and hope and risk only to have me flee a second time when fear overwhelmed reason. If I said yes now, I needed to mean it. I needed to be prepared for the scandal that would result from our union, for his mother's disapproval, for the whispers and speculation that would follow us. I needed to be certain that I could trust him when he said he loved Eleanor Hartley, not some ghost of someone lost, not a convenient replacement, but the specific, particular woman standing before him. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I had been too frightened to recognize before. He was not looking at me with the distant regard of someone seeing through me to someone else. He was looking at me with exasperation and hope, and a kind of desperate vulnerability that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with a man terrified of having his heart broken again by someone he had been foolish enough to love. I told him yes. I meant it. I was certain. I trusted him. And if he was still willing to take a chance on someone who had proven herself capable of spectacular cowardice when faced with the possibility of happiness, I would very much like to accept everything he was offering. The smile that broke across his face was worth every moment of misery I had endured over the past weeks. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, took my hands in his, and told me that he had been waiting for me to come to my senses, that he had known I would eventually realize what we both already understood, that he loved me with a certainty that had nothing to do with anyone else, and everything to do with the stubborn, intelligent, remarkable woman who had somehow decided he was worth the considerable trouble of loving him back. And then, there in the Blackwood's overwrought drawing room, with the household staff almost certainly listening at the door, the Marquis of Ashford kissed me for the first time. It was not tentative or questioning. It was a kiss that felt like a claim and a promise and a beginning, all at once. When we finally separated, I was breathless and slightly dizzy, and more certain than I had ever been about anything that I had made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice, but the right one. We still had details to work through. I needed to extricate myself from my position with the Blackwoods. He needed to make formal arrangements and inform his family. We needed to navigate the complex social machinery that would surround our unconventional union. But those were practical matters, and they suddenly seemed manageable in ways they had not before. Because I was no longer trying to do this alone. I was no longer convinced that I had to protect myself from disappointment by ensuring disappointment. I had someone who saw me clearly and loved what he saw, and who was prepared to face whatever consequences emerged from choosing me over social convention. It was not the ending I had imagined when I first arrived at Pemberton House all those months ago. It was better, because it was real, and it was mine, and it was built on a foundation of actual trust rather than fear disguised as wisdom. The road ahead would not be easy. I understood that. But I was ready to walk it, hand in hand with someone who had proven himself willing to wait for me to stop running long enough to recognize what had been in front of me all along. There are moments in life that divide existence into distinct epochs, a before and an after, so clearly demarcated that you can point to the exact instant when everything changed. For me, that moment occurred not in a glittering ballroom or during a dramatic declaration, but in the practical, mundane process of choosing to trust what I felt, rather than what I feared. The weeks following the Marquess's arrival in Yorkshire unfolded with a velocity that left me slightly breathless. There were, as anticipated, considerable practical matters to address. I needed to provide appropriate notice to the Blackwoods, who received the news of my impending departure with a mixture of disappointment and poorly concealed excitement at having been tangentially involved in what was clearly going to become a significant piece of social gossip. Mrs. Blackwood assured me, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was already composing the letter she would write to all her acquaintances, that she had always known I was destined for greater things. This was a revisionist history so brazen it would have been amusing if I had not been so preoccupied with more immediate concerns. The girls were genuinely sad to see me go, particularly little Catherine, who cried and made me promise to write to her, a promise I fully intended to keep. Alexander. I had finally been given permission to use his given name, an intimacy that still felt slightly scandalous, remained in Yorkshire for several days while arrangements were finalized. We spent long hours walking the grounds of the Blackwood estate and talking about the future we were constructing together. These conversations were markedly different from our earlier exchanges at Pemberton House. There was a directness now, an honesty unencumbered by the fears and misunderstandings that had previously complicated everything. He told me more about his life, the responsibilities that came with his position, the estates that required management, the political obligations he could not simply ignore. He was honest about the challenges I would face as his Marchioness, the scrutiny I would endure, the skills I would need to develop to navigate a world that had not prepared me for such a role. He did not minimize these difficulties or pretend they would be easily overcome. Instead, he expressed confidence that I possessed the intelligence and strength to master whatever was required, and assured me that I would not be facing any of it alone. I, in turn, spoke about my own fears with a candor I had not previously managed. I admitted that I was terrified of inadequacy, of failing to meet the expectations that would be placed upon me, of somehow confirming all the dire predictions that would undoubtedly accompany our unconventional union. I confessed that there remained a small, persistent voice in my mind that whispered I was not enough, not accomplished enough, not refined enough, not worthy of the position I was about to occupy. He listened to all of this without interruption, and when I finished, he took my hands in his and said something I have never forgotten. He told me that worthiness was not something bestowed by birth or acquired through the right family connections. It was something demonstrated through character and action, and the courage to be authentically oneself, even when that self did not conform to others' expectations. By that measure, he said, I was the most worthy person he had ever encountered, and he would spend the rest of his life proving to me what he already knew to be true. It was, perhaps, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. Not because it was flowery or poetic, but because it addressed the exact fear that had driven me to flee in the first place, and offered not empty reassurance, but a partnership built on genuine understanding and mutual respect. The return journey south was conducted under considerably different circumstances than my flight north had been. Alexander insisted on providing a private carriage, far more comfortable than the public coach I had taken previously, and accompanied me himself, propriety be damned. We used the long hours of travel to continue planning our future, addressing practical questions about where we would live, how we would divide our time between his various properties, what role I wanted to play in managing the estates and the household. His assumption that I would want an active role, that I would have opinions and preferences that deserved consideration, was still something I was adjusting to. I had spent so long in positions where my function was to be useful while remaining invisible, that the notion of actually having authority over anything beyond my own small sphere felt almost fantastical. We stopped at an inn the first evening, and Alexander arranged for separate rooms with the kind of scrupulous attention to propriety that seemed slightly ironic, given that we were traveling together without a chaperone. But he was conscious, he explained, of protecting my reputation as much as possible before we were formally married. There would be enough scandal to weather without adding fuel through careless behavior now. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a small inn somewhere between Yorkshire and London, I experienced something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. Genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Not the desperate, fragile hope that had characterized my early feelings for Alexander, always shadowed by fear of disappointment. Not the grim satisfaction of duty performed adequately that had marked my time with the Blackwoods. But actual happiness, built on the solid foundation of knowing I was loved for exactly who I was, by someone who understood both my strengths and my weaknesses, and valued me nonetheless. We arrived in London 3 days later. Alexander had a townhouse there, one of several properties, he mentioned almost apologetically, as if embarrassed by the wealth he had done nothing to earn beyond the accident of birth. The house was elegant without being ostentatious, comfortable in ways that suggested it was actually lived in rather than maintained purely for display. The staff received us with the kind of professional discretion that suggested they had been thoroughly briefed on the situation and had been instructed to treat me with respect, regardless of their private opinions about their employer's choice of bride. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, was particularly welcoming, showing me through the house and explaining various household arrangements with a thoroughness that suggested she anticipated I would actually be making decisions rather than simply occupying decorative space. The formal announcement of our engagement could not be delayed much longer. Alexander had already informed his mother, a conversation he described as challenging, with the kind of massive understatement that would have been funny if I had not been so anxious about the consequences. The dowager had, predictably, expressed strong disapproval, and made various dire predictions about the damage this unsuitable match would inflict on the family's standing. Alexander had listened politely, and then informed her that his decision was final, and he expected her to conduct herself with appropriate civility toward his future wife. I was not optimistic about the dowager's willingness to comply with this expectation, but that was a battle for another day. First, we needed to navigate the formal social announcement and the inevitable storm of gossip and speculation that would follow. The engagement notice appeared in the Times the following week. The response was immediate and exactly as dramatic as anticipated. Invitations that had been extended were suddenly withdrawn. People who had been perfectly cordial during my brief period as a curiosity at Pemberton House now cut me directly on the street. The speculation about my background, my motivations, and my suitability ranged from merely insulting to creatively vicious. But there was another response as well, one I had not entirely anticipated. There were people, not many, but enough to matter, who seemed genuinely pleased by what they viewed as a romantic story. A marquess choosing love over convention. A poor but worthy young woman elevated by genuine affection rather than calculation. It was the stuff of novels, they said, and they were delighted to see it playing out in reality. Lady Constance, I learned through mutual acquaintances, had been apoplectic at the news. She had apparently invested considerable effort in spreading rumors about my mercenary motivations, only to have those rumors backfire when it became clear that Alexander had pursued me, rather than the reverse. The Viscountess, meanwhile, was dining out extensively on her role in our story, having apparently convinced herself that she had actively facilitated the match rather than merely hosting the ball where we first encountered each other. The wedding was planned for early autumn, allowing enough time for appropriate preparations, but not so much time that the extended engagement would generate additional gossip. Alexander wanted to marry immediately. He informed me with charming impatience, tired of waiting and eager to begin our actual life together. But there were forms to be observed, families to be accommodated, and a certain amount of social theater that needed to be performed regardless of our personal preferences. His mother remained coldly distant, though she did consent to attend the wedding, which Alexander counted as a minor victory. She had, he reported, made it clear that she expected me to fail spectacularly at the role of Marchioness, and was prepared to document every misstep for future reference. It was not exactly the warm family welcome one might hope for, but it was probably the best I could expect under the circumstances. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity, fittings for a wedding dress far more elaborate than anything I had ever worn, meetings with various household staff and estate managers, lessons in the particular skills and knowledge expected of someone in my soon-to-be position. It was overwhelming and occasionally terrifying, but Alexander remained steadfast in his support, always available to answer questions or provide reassurance when the magnitude of what I was undertaking threatened to crush me. There was one final piece of unfinished business that required attention before the wedding. I needed to visit Pemberton House and collect the few remaining possessions I had left behind in my hasty departure. I had been avoiding this task, knowing it would mean encountering Lady Constance and reliving memories I preferred to leave undisturbed. But it could not be postponed indefinitely, and I finally steeled myself to make the visit. The Viscountess received me with an effusiveness that would have been funny if it had not been so transparent. I was now someone who mattered, and she was determined to ensure I remembered her role, however minimal, in my transformation. She insisted on tea, on a tour of the gardens where Alexander and I had taken so many walks, on a lengthy recounting of how she had always known we were perfectly suited to each other. I endured this performance with as much grace as I could manage, mostly because I knew it would end more quickly if I simply allowed her to complete her narrative without interruption. Lady Constance, I was informed, was visiting family in Scotland and would not be present during my visit. I suspected this absence was not coincidental. Facing me now, when I had achieved exactly what she had insisted was impossible, would have required more graciousness than Lady Constance likely possessed. As I was preparing to depart, the Viscountess made one final observation that struck me as genuinely perceptive despite her generally superficial nature. She said that she had watched many young women navigate the complexities of society and the marriage market, and the ones who succeeded were not necessarily the most beautiful or the best connected. They were the ones who understood their own worth and refused to accept less than they deserved. She believed, she said, that I possessed this quality in abundance, and it was exactly what would allow me to thrive in a position that defeated women who appeared on the surface, far better qualified. It was unexpected wisdom from an unexpected source, and I left Pemberton House with a slightly more charitable view of the Viscountess than I had maintained during my residence there. The wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed almost implausibly appropriate. Clear skies, gentle sunshine, a light breeze that prevented the heat from becoming oppressive. The ceremony was held at Alexander's family church, an ancient stone building that had witnessed Thornbury weddings for generations. The guest list was smaller than would typically be expected for a Marquess's wedding, a concession to the controversial nature of our match and a reflection of Alexander's limited patience for extended social theater. My aunt attended, looking uncomfortable but attempting to project appropriate dignity. She had, since the engagement announcement, revised her entire assessment of my character and judgment, apparently having forgotten every criticism she had leveled at me over the years. I was gracious about this revisionism, mostly because holding grudges seemed like a waste of energy better devoted to the future I was building. As I walked down the aisle toward Alexander, who was watching me with an expression that made my heart race, I experienced a moment of such perfect clarity that time seemed to briefly suspend itself. This was real. This was happening. The impossible thing that I had convinced myself I could never have was actually mine, not because I had manipulated or schemed or become someone other than myself, but because I had finally been brave enough to trust that I was enough exactly as I was. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I spoke my vows with a steadiness that surprised me, given that my hands were shaking. Alexander's voice was clear and firm, no hesitation or doubt evident in his responses. When the officiant pronounced us married, and Alexander kissed me, a proper public kiss that still managed to feel intimate and just slightly scandalous, I heard a few audible gasps from the assembled guests. The Marquis of Ashford, displaying genuine emotion in public. It was apparently quite shocking. The wedding breakfast that followed was elegant, but not excessive. Alexander had been firm about avoiding the kind of ostentatious display that would have emphasized the differences between our backgrounds. He wanted a celebration that felt like an actual beginning, rather than a performance for the benefit of people whose opinions neither of us particularly valued. As the afternoon progressed and guests began departing, Alexander and I finally found ourselves alone in the garden of our London townhouse. We stood there in companionable silence for a moment, both processing the fact that we were now actually married, that the long, complicated journey from that first encounter at Pemberton House had led to this moment. He asked me if I was happy. It was a simple question, but it carried weight given everything we had been through to reach this point. I told him the truth, that I was happier than I had ever been, and simultaneously terrified about whether I could successfully navigate the life I had just committed to, that these two feelings coexisted without contradiction, and I suspected they would continue to do so for quite some time. He laughed and pulled me close, resting his chin on top of my head, in a gesture that had become familiar over recent weeks. He informed me that he had complete confidence in my ability to master whatever challenges emerged, and that watching me do so would be one of the great pleasures of his life. Also, he added with the kind of intimate warmth that still made me blush, there would be other pleasures to explore as well, now that we were finally, properly married. We remained in London for a week before departing for his estate in Northumberland. Alexander wanted to show me the place he considered his true home, the landscape that had shaped him long before titles and responsibilities had complicated everything. We traveled north in easy stages, stopping frequently to explore interesting towns, or simply to walk through countryside that grew progressively wilder as we left the cultivated south behind. The estate, when we finally arrived, was everything Alexander had described and more. The house itself was ancient, parts of it dating back centuries, but it had been maintained and updated with care, rather than subjected to the kind of aggressive modernization that sometimes destroyed historical character. The landscape was dramatic, rolling hills, rocky outcroppings, a quality of light that was indeed unlike anywhere else I had experienced. The staff received us warmly, clearly devoted to Alexander, and willing to extend that devotion to his new wife, at least provisionally. The housekeeper, Mrs. McLeish, reminded me strongly of my own mother, practical, kind, and possessed of the kind of quiet competence that actually kept households functioning regardless of who received official credit. Alexander had arranged for extensive time away from London and social obligations. He wanted, he said, to give me space to adjust to my new role, without the constant pressure of performance that would be required once we returned to more public spheres. It was a gift I had not known I needed, this breathing room to simply be, to learn, to make mistakes without an audience documenting every misstep. We spent weeks exploring the estate, meeting tenants, reviewing accounts and agricultural practices, discussing improvements and investments. Alexander consulted me on every decision, not as a courtesy, but because he genuinely valued my perspective. When I hesitated, uncertain whether my opinions had merit, he would remind me that intelligence was not the exclusive province of those born to privilege, and my ability to see situations from angles he had never considered was precisely what made my input valuable. I began to find my footing. Not perfectly. There were still moments of doubt and inadequacy, still situations where I felt hopelessly out of my depth. But increasingly, there were also moments where I understood what needed to be done, and simply did it, without waiting for permission or validation from others. Mrs. McLeish became an unexpected ally, teaching me the practical realities of household management that no amount of theoretical knowledge could have provided. The tenants, initially wary of this unusual marchioness with her questionable background, gradually warmed as they observed that I actually listened to their concerns and advocated for their interests in discussions with estate managers. Letters arrived regularly from London, bringing news of society's continued fascination with our unconventional marriage. The gossip had not died down so much as evolved, from speculation about how long the marriage would last to analysis of whether I was successfully adapting to my new position. I learned to view these reports with amused detachment, rather than anxiety. People would talk regardless of what I did. I might as well give them something interesting to discuss. Alexander's mother made one visit during our time in Northumberland. It was as uncomfortable as anticipated, the dowager making her displeasure clear through careful comments and pointed observations about how things had been done in her day. But there was also, toward the end of her stay, a moment of unexpected honesty. She informed me, in private, that she had not wanted this marriage. She had believed it was a mistake that Alexander would come to regret, but she could see that he was happy, genuinely happy in ways he had not been since before Caroline's death. And while she remained unconvinced about my suitability for the role I had assumed, she acknowledged that perhaps, just perhaps, her son had understood something she had not. It was not exactly a warm endorsement, but it was considerably more than I had expected. I thanked her for her candor, and assured her that I would do everything in my power to justify Alexander's faith in me. She responded that time would tell, which was probably the best I could hope for under the circumstances. Autumn deepened into winter. We eventually returned to London, ready to face whatever social obligations and challenges awaited. I was nervous about this return, knowing that my performance would be scrutinized intensely. But I was also ready, not because I had somehow become someone other than Eleanor Hartley, but because I had learned that being Eleanor Hartley was enough. The first major social event we attended was a ball hosted by one of Alexander's cousins. I wore a dress that cost more than my father had earned in a year. My hair was arranged by a maid with considerably more skill than I possessed, and I walked into that ballroom on Alexander's arm with my head high and my spine straight. People stared. Of course they stared. The poor companion who had somehow captured the Marquis of Ashford was still a source of endless fascination. But the quality of that attention had shifted. Instead of contempt or amusement, I saw curiosity, assessment, and in some faces, something that looked almost like respect. Lady Constance was there, having apparently returned from Scotland. We encountered each other near the refreshment tables, a location that carried its own ironic resonance given our history. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite parse, something complex that mixed resentment with something else that might have been grudging acknowledgement. She congratulated me on my marriage with a politeness that fooled no one. I thanked her with equal insincerity, and then, because I was feeling generous and because holding on to anger served no useful purpose, I added that I hoped she would find her own happiness, whatever form that might take. She looked genuinely surprised by this grace, as if she had been expecting continued hostility. After a moment, she responded that perhaps she had been too quick to judge what was possible and what was not. It was the closest thing to an apology I would likely ever receive from Lady Constance, and I accepted it as such. The evening progressed without incident. I danced with Alexander and with various other gentlemen who requested the honor, navigated conversations with reasonable competence, and generally managed to avoid any catastrophic social failures. When we finally returned home in the early morning hours, I was exhausted, but satisfied. Alexander asked, as we prepared for bed, whether I had any regrets, whether the reality of being a marchioness matched whatever expectations I had maintained. I considered the question seriously before answering. I told him that it was harder than I had anticipated in some ways, and easier in others, that I still had moments of doubt and uncertainty, and suspected I always would, but that I had no regrets about the choice I had made, the choice to trust him, to trust myself, to believe that love could transcend the artificial barriers society erected. He smiled and pulled me into his arms, and in that moment, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. The happy ending I had been searching for was not a destination to be reached, but a choice to be made repeatedly, day after day, in the face of challenges and doubts, and the persistent human tendency to complicate what should be simple. I had been mocked for being poor. I had been told I was unsuitable, inappropriate, reaching above my natural station. And then the Marquis of Ashford had lifted my chin and called me my lady, and everything had changed. Not because he had elevated me to his position, but because he had seen me as I was, and decided that was exactly who he wanted. It was not the story I had imagined for myself during those long, painful months as a companion at Pemberton House. It was better, because it was real, and it was mine, and it had been earned through the courage to believe I deserved happiness rather than simply survival. The future would bring its own challenges. Alexander's mother would likely never fully accept me. Society would continue to gossip and speculate. I would make mistakes and face situations where my lack of traditional preparation showed. But I would face all of it with Alexander beside me, and with the hard-won knowledge that I was enough exactly as I was. As I drifted off to sleep that night, warm and safe and genuinely happy, I thought about the woman I had been just months ago, frightened, convinced of her own inadequacy, prepared to settle for scraps of affection, and call it enough. She seemed like a stranger now, that woman. Someone I had been but was no longer. I had been poor. I had been mocked. I had been told that people like me did not get to aspire to lives like this. And I had proven all of them wrong, not by becoming someone else, but by having the courage to trust that who I already was deserved love and happiness, and a future built on solid foundations, rather than desperate compromises. It was, I reflected in those last moments before sleep claimed me, quite a good story. And the best part was that it was only the beginning.